Zelensky and EU leaders to hold call with Trump ahead of Putin's summit. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is joining European leaders in talks aimed at increasing pressure on U.S. President Donald Trump to side with Ukraine during Friday's summit with his Russian counterpart in Alaska. In an online call with Trump on Wednesday, the leaders are expected to reiterate that no decisions should be taken without Ukraine, including changing its borders by force. Trump has said any peace deal would involve some swapping of territories, and it is believed one of Vladimir Putin's demands is that Kyiv surrenders the parts of the eastern Donbas area it still controls. On Tuesday, Zelensky said such a concession could be used as a springboard for future attacks by Russia. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. A Russian summer offensive has been progressing with troops making a sudden thrust near the eastern town of Dobropillia and advancing 10 km 6 miles in a short period of time. While downplaying Russia's advance, Zelensky said it was clear to us that Moscow's objective was to create a certain information space before Putin meets Trump that Russia is moving forward, advancing, while Ukraine is losing. No official details have emerged on what demands Putin could make when he meets Trump in Anchorage on Friday. However, there has been concern among Ukraine's European allies about the possibility of Trump agreeing to Putin's demands. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has called Wednesday's meeting, and Zelensky is traveling to Berlin to join him for the video call with other European leaders, including UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, before the call with Trump. Ukraine's borders must not be changed by force. EU leaders say why Trump and Putin are meeting in Alaska. Why did Putin's Russia invade Ukraine? Zelensky has previously insisted that Ukrainians would not gift their land to the occupier, and pointed to the country's constitution, which requires a referendum before a change in its territory. Last week, Trump said there would be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both. Russia and Ukraine sparking concern in Kyiv and across Europe that Moscow could be allowed to redraw Ukraine's borders by force. Russia currently controls just under 20% of Ukrainian territory. The Donbas, made up of the eastern regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, has been partly occupied by Russia since 2014. Moscow now holds almost all of Luhansk and about 70% of Donetsk. But speaking to reporters on Tuesday, Zelensky reaffirmed that Ukraine would reject any proposal to leave the Donbas. The White House on Tuesday said the Alaska talks would be a listening exercise for Trump, and added having him and Putin sit down in the same room would give the U.S. president the best indication on how to end this war. It follows Trump describing the summit as a feel-out meeting on Monday, seeming to tone down expectations that Friday's meeting could bring Ukraine and Russia closer to peace. When he announced the summit last week, Trump sounded positive that the meeting could result in concrete steps towards peace. "I think my gut instinct really tells me that we have a shot at it," he said. The Ukrainian leader has previously said any agreements without Kyiv's involvement would amount to dead decisions. Now we will analyze this report. Unity and pressure. Europe and Ukraine align to safeguard Kyiv's voice. European and Ukrainian leaders are coordinating closely to ensure that President Trump hears a unified and unwavering message before he meets Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Ukraine must not be excluded from any decisions about its own future, and its borders cannot be altered by force. This effort reflects deep concern in Kyiv and across European capitals that Moscow may push for concessions, such as Ukraine surrendering parts of the Donbas region it still controls, in exchange for a ceasefire. The planned online meeting, called by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and joined by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, is designed to maximize diplomatic pressure on Washington ahead of the high-stakes summit. The strategy is not only about influencing Trump's negotiating position, but also about signaling to Putin that the West remains unified in rejecting any settlement that legitimizes territorial gains made through aggression. For Ukraine, participation in this call is vital. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Kyiv has insisted that no international agreement involving its sovereignty can be made without its direct involvement. Zelensky has repeatedly argued that Ukraine's constitution requires a nationwide referendum before any change in territorial boundaries, making unilateral decisions by foreign leaders legally and politically unacceptable. The fear among Ukrainian officials is that even a trial balloon discussion of territory swaps could embolden Moscow, erode Western resolve, and weaken Ukraine's position on the battlefield. From the European side, the message is equally strategic. EU leaders understand that if Trump signals flexibility on territorial concessions, it could fracture the transatlantic consensus that has held since 2022. By presenting a united front, they hope to remind Washington that any durable peace must be rooted in international law and the principle that borders cannot be changed by force, a standard Europe has upheld since World War II. This coordinated stance is also meant to counter the perception, cultivated by Moscow, that Western support for Ukraine is waning as the war drags on. In effect, the pre-summit call is both a diplomatic safeguard and a political statement. It ensures that Trump enters his meeting with Putin aware of the risks legal, moral, and geopolitical of sidelining Ukraine. It also serves as a public reaffirmation to Ukrainians and to the wider world that Kyiv's allies are committed not just to ending the war, but to ending it in a way that protects Ukraine's sovereignty and deters future acts of territorial aggression. Trump's summit framed as listening exercise low stakes, high stakes. President Trump's characterization of the upcoming Alaska summit with Vladimir Putin as a feel-out or listening exercise is a deliberate attempt to set low expectations while leaving himself room to maneuver. Publicly framing the meeting in such terms helps to reduce political pressure for immediate, concrete outcomes, giving Trump the flexibility to adjust his position based on how the discussion unfolds. Yet beneath this seemingly casual description lies a much more consequential reality. The topics likely to be raised, particularly the possibility of territorial swaps between Russia and Ukraine, carry enormous geopolitical weight and could fundamentally alter the course of the war. The White House has emphasized that this meeting is not intended to produce binding agreements, portraying it instead as an opportunity for Trump to directly assess Putin's willingness to compromise. However, recent comments from Trump, in which he suggested that some swapping of territories might benefit both sides, have alarmed Kyiv and European capitals alike. For Ukraine, such remarks hint at a willingness to legitimize Russia's seizure of territory, a move that would not only violate international law, but also set a dangerous precedent for other conflicts around the world. European leaders fear that even floating this idea could weaken their united stance, embolden Russia to push for more, and undermine the principle that borders cannot be altered by military force. In diplomatic terms, the listening exercise label serves multiple functions. It signals to Moscow that the U.S. is open to hearing proposals without committing to endorse them, potentially encouraging Putin to reveal his negotiating position more openly. It also reassures Trump's domestic political base that he is approaching the situation pragmatically, without rushing into commitments that could be politically risky. At the same time, this approach can be unsettling for allies who worry that leaving the door open to territorial concessions, no matter how tentative, could erode hard-won diplomatic gains made since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. the stakes are further heightened by the timing. Russia has recently made notable advances on the battlefield, including a rapid push near Dobropillia, which could be used by Putin as leverage in talks. Against this backdrop, Trump's informal framing of the summit does little to allay concerns that Putin will use the meeting to pressure for concessions, counting on Trump's reputation for deal-making to secure a favorable outcome. Ultimately, while calling the Alaska talks a feel-out session may lower public expectations, it does not diminish the significance of what is at stake. The meeting will be closely watched not for immediate agreements, but for signals both subtle and explicit about whether the U.S. is prepared to stand firm alongside Ukraine or entertain compromises that could reshape the European security landscape for decades. Zelensky's resolute refusal of territorial concessions. President Volodymyr Zelensky has made it unequivocally clear that Ukraine will not concede any of its territory, particularly in the eastern Donbas region, in exchange for a ceasefire or peace settlement. His position is rooted not only in political conviction, but also in Ukraine's constitutional framework, which mandates that any change to the country's territorial boundaries must be decided by a nationwide referendum. This legal safeguard reflects the broader will of the Ukrainian people, who have endured more than 2 years of full-scale war and see territorial concessions as both a moral defeat and a strategic vulnerability. For Zelensky, giving up land to Russia would not bring lasting peace. It would only serve as a temporary pause in hostilities before Moscow regrouped and launched further attacks. This stance is informed by hard experience. Since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its partial occupation of the Donbas that same year, Ukraine has seen that ceding territory does not deter aggression. It invites more of it. The Kremlin's actions since February 2022 have only reinforced this conclusion. Even as Moscow demands control of the remaining Ukrainian-held portions of Donetsk and Luhansk, its forces have continued offensives elsewhere, signaling that their objectives extend well beyond Donbas. Zelensky has warned that any compromise on this front would embolden Russia, undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, and destabilize the entire region. From a geopolitical perspective, his refusal also serves as a message to allies and adversaries alike. To allies, it demonstrates that Ukraine will not barter away its sovereignty, thus justifying continued military and economic support. To adversaries, it communicates that Ukraine is prepared for the long fight, and that attempts to force concessions through battlefield pressure will fail. This resolve is critical for maintaining morale at home and sustaining the trust of soldiers who are risking their lives to defend territory that some outside actors might be tempted to trade away for political expediency. There is also a historical dimension to Zelensky's position. Europe's post-World War Roman II order was built on the principle that borders cannot be changed by force, a norm that has kept major powers from attempting to redraw maps at will. If Ukraine were to accept territorial loss under duress, it would erode that principle, potentially encouraging similar acts of aggression elsewhere in the world. Zelensky's firm stance is therefore not only about protecting Ukraine's land, but also about defending the international rules-based order. In short, Zelensky's rejection of territorial concessions is a combination of constitutional obligation, historical lesson, and strategic foresight. It reflects a belief that genuine peace can only be achieved through the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, not through deals that reward aggression and leave the door open for future wars. On-the-ground realities, Russian advances heighten urgency. Russian forces have recently intensified their military operations in eastern Ukraine, making a sudden and notable advance near the town of Dobropillia in Donetsk. Reports indicate that Russian troops have moved forward by roughly 10 kilometers in a short period, a pace that, while not decisive in itself, is significant given the grinding nature of the war. Over the past year, this advance is believed to be part of a calculated push to create a perception of momentum ahead of the upcoming Putin-Trump summit in Alaska. Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky, have suggested that Moscow is seeking to shape an information space in which Russia appears to be advancing and Ukraine appears to be losing, thereby strengthening Putin's bargaining position. From a strategic standpoint, these battlefield developments serve multiple purposes for the Kremlin. Militarily, they aim to stretch Ukrainian defenses in an already challenging operational environment, forcing Kyiv to divert troops and resources to counter localized offensives. Politically, the optics of forward movement, even if limited in scale, can be leveraged in diplomatic talks to argue for territorial concessions in exchange for a ceasefire. By creating facts on the ground, Russia can claim a stronger hand at the negotiating table, even if those gains are not yet strategically decisive. For Ukraine, these advances underscore the dangers of negotiating from a position of perceived weakness. While Ukrainian forces have downplayed the scale of the Russian push, they are fully aware that the timing is no accident. The Kremlin understands that even modest territorial gains, if made visible in the media, can alter international perceptions of the conflict's trajectory. This is particularly concerning when key global actors, such as the United States, are preparing for high-level talks that could touch on issues of territory and sovereignty. The situation also highlights the interplay between battlefield realities and diplomatic maneuvering. In modern conflicts, the psychological and informational dimensions are as important as the physical control of territory. Russia's move near Dobropillia may not drastically change the front lines in the short term, but it can be framed domestically as a sign of progress and internationally as leverage. For Ukraine and its allies, countering this narrative is as crucial as holding the line militarily. Ultimately, the advances near Dobropillia are a reminder that the war is not static. Even small tactical shifts can have outsized diplomatic implications, especially when timed to influence high-profile international meetings. For Kyiv, the challenge lies in preventing these developments from shaping the narrative in ways that weaken its position, both on the battlefield and in the negotiating room.